Hello and welcome to the Lettings Triad. In today's episode we're talking about something that always gets attention, and that's rent increases in Wales. In this episode we'll cover when you can do it, how to do it properly, and how to avoid getting it completely wrong. This is one of those topics where landlords can either protect their investment or accidentally land themselves in trouble. So, first off, why are rents going up? Now, a lot of people assume it's just landlords putting prices up for the sake of it, and whilst this might be the case in a very small number of instances, the reality is a lot more grounded in basic economics. Costs have increased across the board, and quite significantly over the last few years. You've got mortgage rates, which for many landlords have doubled or even tripled when coming off fixed-term deals. That alone can completely change the profitability of a property. Then there's maintenance. Labour costs are up, materials are up, and even getting trades booked in is far more expensive than it used to be. Insurance is another big one. Landlords' policies have risen sharply, particularly with more risk awareness in the market. And then you've got compliance, where landlords have to meet strict requirements through schemes like Rent Smart Wales here in Wales, along with ongoing safety regulations, EPC expectations, and general legal obligations. So, all of this adds up. When you look at it properly, if a landlord keeps rent exactly the same year after year, while all their costs are increasing, they're not even standing still. They're actually going backwards. Margins get squeezed, and over time that property becomes less and less sustainable as an investment. And that's the key point. This isn't about greed, it's about viability. Because if a property isn't financially viable, landlords will exit the market. And when supply drops, that creates even more pressure on rent overall. So, in many cases, a sensible, controlled rent increase isn't just justified, it's actually necessary to keep the property running as long-term rental. So, when can the increase be served? Now, this is where people get caught out, and it's probably one of the most misunderstood areas in Welsh lettings. Let's start with a fixed-term contract. If you've got a tenant tied into a fixed term, 6-month, 12-month, whatever it might be, you cannot just decide to increase the rent halfway through. The only way you can do this is if there is a rent review clause written into the occupational contract from the beginning. And not just any old clause. It needs to be clear, fair, and properly drafted. It should explain when the rent can be reviewed, how it is calculated, and how notice will be given. If that clause isn't there, then legally, the rent is locked in for the duration of that fixed term. No clause, no increase. It really is that straightforward. Now, where things change is when the contract becomes periodic, so once that fixed term has ended and the tenancy is on a rolling month to month. At that point, landlords do have the ability to increase the rent, but again, it has to be done properly. You can't just send a text or drop it into conversation. There is a prescribed legal process, and if you don't follow it, the increase is simply not valid. You must use the correct notice, which is the RHW 12 form. If self-managing, you could obtain this from the .gov website. The notice period is 2 months, and importantly, you can only increase the rent once every 12 months. If it's not done correctly, you risk the increase being challenged or completely unenforceable. So the key takeaway here is this: your ability to increase rent depends entirely on the type of contract you're dealing with and whether you've set things up properly from the start. Get the contract right and the process is straightforward. Get it wrong and you limit your options completely. Now let's talk about how much you can actually increase the rent by. And this is where a bit of strategy comes into play. In Wales, there's no fixed cap on rent increases. So technically, you're not restricted to a specific percentage or amount. But, and this is an important part, it has to reflect market rent. So you just can't pick a number that works for you financially and expect it to stick. It needs to be justifiable. That means looking at comparable properties in the area of a similar size, similar condition, and in a similar location. What are they achieving? How quickly were they let? Are they sitting empty or are they being snapped up? Demand plays a big role here. If stock is low and demand is high, there's naturally more room to increase. But if the market is softer, pushing too far can backfire. And there's the condition of the property. If you're increasing the rent, the product has to match. Tenants will compare online instantly, and if your property doesn't stack up, they'll either challenge the rent increase or they will walk away. Now here's the key point, and this is where experience really matters. Just because you can increase the rent by a large amount, it doesn't mean you should. On paper, a £150 increase might look great, but if that leads to a tenant leaving, you've got void periods, potential reletting cost, and the risk of losing a reliable tenant. Suddenly, that gain disappears. Whereas a smaller, sensible increase, £50, £75, often keeps a good tenant in place. Someone who pays on time, looks after the property, and causes no issues. And from a long-term investment perspective, that consistency is often far more valuable than chasing maximum rents every single time. So, the goal isn't just to increase rent, it's to increase it in a way that protects your income, your asset, and your tenant-landlord relationship. So what do you do if you're a tenant and you've received a rent increase notice? Now let's look at this from the tenant's perspective because it is equally as important. If a tenant receives a rent increase, the first thing you should do is understand that you do have options. They are not completely powerless in this situation. The more straightforward option is to accept the increase. Now, if the new rent is in line with the market and still affordable, then the tenancy simply will continue as normal, just with the new agreed figure. The second option is to negotiate, and this is something that's often overlooked. If a tenant has a strong track record, paying the rent on time, looking after the property with no issues, you're in a good position to have that conversation. Landlords and agents will often weigh up the value of a reliable tenant against pushing for maximum rent. So there can be room to agree something slightly lower than the proposed increase. The third option is to challenge the increase. If you genuinely believe the new rent is above market value, then you can take steps to dispute it through the appropriate tribunal process. Now, this isn't about avoiding an increase altogether. It's about ensuring the figure is fair and reflects the local market and the property condition. And finally, there's the option to leave. If the increase makes the property unaffordable or no arrangement can be reached, you can serve notice and move on, if, of course, on a periodic contract. But this is where you as the tenant need to think carefully as well, because moving comes with its own costs, deposits, moving expenses, and sometimes the rent can be even higher elsewhere. So it's not always the straightforward solution it might seem. The key takeaway here is the tenant should stay informed, communicate early, and make a decision based on their financial position and what's happening in the local market. So let's run through a few common mistakes to avoid, because this is where landlords and some agents can easily come unstuck. Firstly, trying to increase rent during a fixed term without a rent review clause. This happens more than you actually think. And landlords' costs go up, they react to the market, and they try to push through an increase mid-term. But if there's no clause in the contract allowing for this increase to happen, it's simply not enforceable. And worse than that, it can damage the relationship with the tenant straight away. Secondly, not using the correct legal process, specifically the RHW12 form. In Wales, this isn't an option. You can't rely on an email, a phone call, or even written agreement outside of the prescribed notice. If the correct form isn't used, the increase isn't valid, full stop. Thirdly, getting the notice period wrong. You need to give a minimum of 2 months' notice, and this has to be clear and properly served. If the timing is off, or the notice isn't handled correctly, again, you're opening yourself up to disputes or delays. Fourthly, increasing rent more than once in a 12-month period. This is a hard rule in Wales, and it catches people out. You can't stagger increases or revisit it every few months. It's one increase per year per contract, unless the tenant is in complete agreement and a new fixed term is created. For example, the tenant might sign for an initial 6-month fixed term in January. In theory, the rent cannot be increased until January of the next year. However, if after the first 6 months you agree a new fixed term at a higher rent and both parties are in complete agreement, this is perfectly okay. And finally, and probably the biggest one, poor communication. Even when everything is legally correct, if the increase is handled badly, it creates unnecessary tension. Sending a cold notice with no explanation, no context, and no conversation beforehand can lead to frustration, disputes, or tenants deciding to leave. Whereas a simple conversation explaining why the increase is happening, giving the tenant time to process it, and being open to discussions can make a huge difference. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a legal process, it's people and business. Just how you handle that conversation often determines the outcome, just as the numbers do. The best landlords don't treat rent reviews as a reactive move. They treat them as part of a long-term strategy. It's not about looking at the market once a year, seeing what others are charging, and immediately trying to match or exceed that. It's about understanding the bigger picture, your cash flow, your costs, your tenant profile, and the long-term performance of your asset. Because rental property isn't a short-term play. It's about consistency, stability, and risk management over time. And this is where a lot of people get it wrong. They focus purely on achieving the highest possible rent in that moment without considering the knock-on effects. If you push too hard, you increase the likelihood of the tenant leaving. And once that happens, you are dealing with void periods, potential re-let fees, referencing, and the uncertainty of who comes in next. Not to mention the risk of getting a tenant who doesn't pay on time, who doesn't look after the property in the same way. All of that has a cost, both financially and in terms of stress and time. Whereas a modest, well-judged increase, something that keeps the rent aligned with the market but still fair, often results in the tenant staying put. A good tenant over a number of years is one of the most valuable assets a landlord can have. They provide consistent income, reduce wear and tear through responsible living, and minimise management issues. So when you look at it properly, the goal isn't to maximise rent in a single point in time, it's to optimise the performance of the property over a long term. And that often means making decisions that favour stability over short-term gains. Now, this is also where self-managing landlords need to take a step back and be honest about the process, because managing rent increases properly isn't just about picking a number out of thin air. It's about timing, compliance, paperwork, and communication. You've got to track when increases are due, make sure you're within the 12-month rule, serve the correct notice, and be prepared to handle any negotiation or pushback. And that's where using a professional agent can make a significant difference. A good agent will carry out regular rent reviews based on real market data and not guesswork. They'll ensure everything is legally compliant, including serving the correct notice at the right time. And more importantly, they'll handle the conversation, whether that's explaining the increase to the tenant or negotiating a figure that keeps everyone on side. So using an agent takes the pressure off, it removes the risk of getting it wrong, and turns what can be an awkward process into a straightforward one. For many landlords, that alone justifies a management fee, because it's not just about convenience, it's about protecting the asset and the income it generates. So that's rent increases in Wales, what you can do legally and what you should do commercially. Get it right and you protect both your income and your reputation, and that's what it's all about. Thanks for listening once again. If this helped, be sure to like and share with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay sharp, stay compliant, and stay profitable. Cheerio.